Good afternoon again. Let's get started. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Let me call you to attention, please. I hear all the robust conversations. Let me call your attention, please. Let's begin. Please get to your seats as quickly as possible. How's everything going? Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Let's get started. May I have your attention? I have some announcements I'd like to share before we get started. Thank you very much. So allow me to do a brief bit of housekeeping before I pivot to our panel. So there have been some events that have been organized for you. Pleasure Activism Agenda. Friday, today, July 19th. Location, Spirit Lodge, 242 51st Street off Butler Avenue. Spirit Happy Hour until 7 p.m. There's a dinner menu available. And the CUESEF Soul Show, 7 to 10 p.m. Mix, mingle, dine, and drink with CUESEF folks and friends. You all can take these very intellectual conversations and ponder them over libations and good food. And then Saturday, tomorrow night, and actually it's free for CUESEF attendees, so wear your wonderful badges before 10 p.m. and $5 with badge if you come after for the stragglers. Location for tomorrow, August Wilson African American Cultural Center at 980 downtown Liberty Avenue. Race and Revolution, still separate, still unequal. There's an art exhibit on racial and economic disparities in the U.S. public schools, open until 8 p.m. That's tomorrow. And free art-making workshops with the Race and Revolution artists from 2 to 4 p.m. That's tomorrow afternoon for those who will still be here and those who are in Pittsburgh. How's everybody doing with their conference? Are we having a wonderful time? So one of the things that happens if you are either planning or facilitating is that you don't get to really do the conference. You have to run around and organize and be part of making sure that we are great hosts for you all. But because of the wonderful leadership of Dr. Dancy and a great team of friends and colleagues, we've been able to also participate in the conference as well. It's not so hectic that it does not allow us opportunity to not engage. And so I've been a part of some interesting workshops and heard some wonderful conversations. And I was identify as black, identify as a black man. Some of that is obvious on plain sight. But one of the things I was thinking about today, I was hearing someone talking about programs that teach African-American men, African-American boys, to prepare themselves for the police stop. And I thought about, in what world do we live that my identity causes me to be prepared for what someone might imagine about me? There was a man named George Zimmerman who imagined that a hoodie and some Skittles meant terror and threat. Even after he called the police and said, "I'm following someone," the police said, "Don't do it." But his imagination about that person's capacity for danger was so strong that it led to one's life being ended. There was no amount of respectability politics that could have saved a young kid named Tamir Rice. Philando Castile, reaching for his wallet, killed in front of his girlfriend, his partner, and his child. You can't teach me enough how to prepare. I think we need to teach police officers how to love, how to see humanity, how to expect the best from me, how to see me as a part of this American project, and how to see me as a participant and not a problem in that project. We have got to start talking about the true issues. There's a thing called race and a thing called capitalism that turned slave ships toward the coast of Africa and brought them back here because race said that there's value placed on that person's skin, on that person's skin, which makes you allow yourself to have the institution of slavery. The institution of slavery is not the original sin. classifying race and assigning value is the original sin. And that's why we're talking about these issues today, because we've got to broach and unearth and discover these topics, because what is happening is people are literally dying. Whether we are silent, we are complicit. We have to encourage each other. This work takes hand-in-hand partnerships. Humanity and love must rule the day. So let's get started again. I don't know where we are. But I know I'm human, and I know you are too. We're getting ready to have a wonderful panel discussion with Marc, Lamont Hill, and Yolanda, Sealey-Ruiz, and again to be moderated by Crystal Laura. I could go on about all of them, the mentorship that I see seated in front of me, the friendship and the encouragement and the love that I've gotten from these senior scholars who could just write their books and walk away and say, you know, meet me for a selfie, but they engage and they mentor and they support. And so I'm appreciative of that. So let's give them a round of applause as we bring them to the stage. And let's get ready for some great, great dialogue.
Hello again, everybody. Derek just slipped away, but let's give all love to him for preaching to us, setting the stage for the conversation that we're about to have. Once again, thrilled to be with you. Let's think of this as a continuation of the conversation that we had this morning. Have some lovely, brilliant souls next to me. We're going to start straight away because I'm sure that you all have lots of questions. Maybe even the folks who we didn't get to earlier might jump in sooner rather than later. But same deal, I want you to think about what you bring to this room, what you wonder, what you worry about, what you question. Prepare to jump in relatively quickly with those thoughts. But we'll begin by getting a sense of the wisdom on this stage. So tell us who you are and tell us a bit about your work.
Everyone, is this on? Yeah, sounds like it is. Hello, beautiful people. My name is Yolanda Sealey-Ruiz, also known as Yoli, to my deep and dear friends, and I'm an associate professor of English education at Teachers College. My work centers on helping teachers get it right. And that sometimes sounds like racial literacy. It sometimes sounds like culturally relevant, responsive, sustaining education. Sometimes it sounds like equity pedagogy, but all the time it sounds like being fully human in the classroom. Great to see you.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
We black, man. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. There we go. I'm honored to be here. First, I got to show some love to Dr. Elon Dancy for putting this together. He's right here. We come a long way, and watching him land here at Pittsburgh and watching the work that he's done in just a short amount of time and the amount of community that he's built and the amount of conversations that he's nurtured. And to see this here today is nothing short of extraordinary. So it's really a testimony to your leadership and your brilliance. So thank you for bringing us all here together. And to be on stage with you two, oh my God. It's such an, I know honestly, I mean, I would have done it for Elon anyway, but when I saw it was y'all, it was like, oh, this is easy. This ain't even, you ain't even had to pay me. Just kidding. He's about to take my W-2 and slide. So, very quickly, my name is Marc Lamont Hill. I am an abolitionist. I am an educator. I am an activist. And I'm trying my best to study and also create spaces inside of formal schools, but also outside of formal schools, where we can imagine a world in which the prison isn't our primary mechanism for adjudicating or responding or resolving the problems of the world. That's it.
So, can you say a bit more about abolitionists' thinking, ways of being, practices, specifically as they might relate to educators?
I'm coming specifically in the, I'm speaking specifically and thinking specifically in the tradition of prison abolition. I think there's a broader context of abolition, of educators as abolitionists, and Bettina Love wrote a wonderful book this year that you should all read that helps us think about teachers as abolitionists writ large, because I think the idea of abolition is something we should all take seriously around a whole host of issues. I come out of a tradition of people who believe that the prison should not be our mechanism for resolving the contradictions of society. I believe in a world without prisons. And I'm always trying to find ways to conjure both my and my colleagues' radical imaginations so that we can imagine a world without prisons. What does that look like? In the societal context, I think it means, one, as a practical matter, decarceration. Decarceration is getting people out of prisons. Thinking about all the ways that we can get people out of prisons right now. For example, getting rid of cash bail, work release programs, suspended sentences. Think about all the ways that we could close the doors to the prison right now. It's also excarceration, which is about thinking about how we can not use the carceral project as a solution. So that means like decriminalizing drugs. That means decriminalizing what we call victimless crimes. It means structural adjustment, getting rid of the things that lead us to the carceral state. After-school programs work. Arts programs work. Music programs work. Big Brothers, Big Sisters work. Getting rid of that. But then there's a deeper crisis of imagination that I want us to think through a little bit. And that's why I love talking to Yolanda. We worked together before, at Teachers College. We started there together. And I love dreaming with her and thinking with her and building with her. So I can't wait to hear her talk about this stuff, because I think we have to get out of the mindset where we think justice means punishment and punishment means confinement, because that's the deeper issue. And so the work of school is to help us unlearn some of that stuff, because that's sometimes the first place where we learn what justice looks like.
Absolutely. Yoli, you want to jump in here? I'm like anxious to talk specifically about racial literacy. I'm super excited to talk about hip-hop pedagogy. I'm really thrilled to talk about culturally responsive pedagogy, partly because I know the folks in the room are looking to walk away with things that they can implement like yesterday. But before we do that, let's flesh this out a bit more. Let me hear your thoughts on abolitionist thinking, ways of being, practices, and then let's bring in the educator role.
First, if I may follow Marc's example and really talk about how grateful and honored I am. Thank you, Dr. Dancy and your staff. My sister Carla Shedd, who's been at this work for a very long time and making inroads of getting people to really think differently. My brother Marc and my sister Crystal, these are scholars who have spent their lives and opened up about their own lives very publicly in terms of how incarceration has impacted and really has shifted our thinking. So I just want to properly thank you, and Marc, and thank you, Crystal and Marc, and talk about how honored I am to be sitting in between the two of them. And now, what was the question? I got it, abolitionist, yes. No, so Dr. Bettina Love, as Marc mentioned, really has given us new language in this book that she's written, We Want to Do More Than Survive, right? Educational, abolitionist teaching in the pursuit of educational freedom. And please put it on your list. I'm teaching it in all of my courses. And Dr. Love is someone who writes it and lives it, as these two scholars do as well. And the idea of abolitionist teaching and taking it from what Marc is saying needs to be applied to education, because there are things that exist in education that just need to be abolished straight up. It is what has existed with us since integration. We know that within the black community, if you ask any black teacher past a particular age, they will tell you that integration was the worst thing that happened for black students, right? They will be honest to talk about Brown versus Board of Education of being a failure. But at the same time, it was a case that really put in the spotlight, right, the inequalities that exist in education. So deficit thinking has to be abolished, right? This idea of not doing self-examination as a teacher, even as a teacher of color, has to be abolished. This idea of children only learning one way through a standardized test, and then in your classroom, you're giving them the 5-paragraph essay, you're only measuring their writing and their thinking in one way, that has to be abolished. So the idea of abolition to teaching are most of the practices that we've been holding on to and the practices that we have been taught with. So let's just reimagine a different world. Let's have abolition of prisons, absolutely. They're trying to do it in New York with Rikers. Rikers is a demon-infested, brutal, I don't have enough words to talk about what Rikers has been and continues to be. Marc, who interviewed Khalif Browder, if you didn't see that interview shortly before Khalif passed away, it destroys lives. So how can we know if our practices go unexamined in schools may lead to a path that can destroy someone's life? We've got to abolish it, y'all.
I'm thinking about radical imagination as the foundation for rethinking how we do, how we respond to harm and healing, how we function as human beings, but certainly as educators too. Can you think of some foundational principles, some non-negotiable commitments upon which we might start that work?
I think the first thing is we have to be willing to let go of all the things we take for granted that have to be. So the logic of capitalism says somebody got to be poor, right? It's easier for people to imagine the end of the world itself than to imagine the end of capitalism, right? So you have to be willing to imagine a new possibility. I was thinking about when my dear brother Kempis Songster Ghani, you put on a conference, Ubuntu, in September. I think it was September 8th. And of last year, and Ubuntu is an African principle that says, I am because we are. And it's a direct response to the kind of European Cartesian, cogito ergo, so I think therefore I am, which is very centered on the self. Ubuntu is I am because we are. And the Ubuntu principle was embodied in this story. We often hear of this Western anthropologist who goes to the continent of Africa, and he's there for a few months doing his, colonial field work. And I don't know if they call it that, but that's what it was. And he played this game with the kids, and he filled these baskets with candy and fruit and all these goodies, and he lined them up and said, you should run to the finish line. Whoever gets there first gets everything. And they said, okay, we'll play. So they lined up, and he said, go. And then they held hands in a circle and ran toward the basket, got it all together, and said, now we all can enjoy it. It's an entirely different framework. It's an entirely different set of assumptions about how the world could work. The anthropologist couldn't understand it because that wasn't his point of reference. And it probably seemed bizarre. But imagine a world where we think about my destiny, my success, my happiness as bound up in yours. And to think that if we live in a world where crime is how we understand harm, which I'll come back to in just real 1 second, where we understand, again, justice as punishment, then we don't understand how having people in cages ultimately puts all of us in a posture where we can't be entirely free. That's what, on some level, that's what the great philosopher Sealey was talking about, right, in The Color Purple, when she looks at Mr. at the end. And she says, the jail you plan for me is the one you're gonna rot in, right? The jail we plan for 2.5 million American citizens is the one we're all rotting in, socially, culturally, our family structures, our economic resources, all of it. We're rotting in that very jail that we plan for them. So for me, in terms of what's a non-negotiable, I think everything's negotiable. At the level of social structures and policies, what's not negotiable is the fundamental humanity of everyone else. What's not negotiable is the redeemability of everybody else, right? That's what Gandhi was talking about earlier. I have to believe that everyone has the possibility to be whole. That doesn't mean that everybody is whole now, because some of y'all are like, yeah, I know some Negroes ain't whole. But what we have to be able to imagine is other possibilities for dealing with harm. How do you do that? By getting rid of the language of crime. People don't commit crimes, they commit acts. And acts get criminalized. So for some of you, that might be a distinction without a difference, but the point is, there are moments in history where us being on the stage was a crime. As my sister said in the session a moment ago, black people parenting their kids was a crime. Interracial marriage, crime. Sitting at a lunch counter, crime. So I'm not worried about the crime, I'm worried about the act. And my question is not, is this a crime or not? It's, does this do harm? And if that becomes my framework, then as I'm trying to navigate the world, my non-negotiable is, I want to reduce harm. And I want to heal people. So I'm no longer asking who did it and how do I punish them. Instead, I'm asking who was harmed and how do I make them whole again? And that framework allows me to hold on to everybody's humanity as a non-negotiable. Everybody's redeemability is a non-negotiable, but realize that there's a whole new world of possibilities if I'm not constantly looking to arrest my way and incarcerate my way or punish my way or suspend my way or expel my way or pink slip my way, as we said in Philly, out of the problem. That make sense?
What else? What are the other non-negotiable principles? So here's where we're going to go. We want to think about the non-negotiable principles as the foundation for new ways of thinking about policy, practice, and process. Building a toolkit of work or ways of being that really move toward this idea that this whole panel is organized around, which is schooling for freedom. So how do we think that then shapes how we act?
Can I ask y'all a question about that? Because I spend less time in classrooms now than I used to, so I'm curious. In the classroom context, are there, in terms of abolitionist teaching, are there things that educators should be thinking about as non-negotiables? You know, like what should we be holding on to?
I could share some things. I'm still in the classroom. I'm teaching a class, English class at a school in the Bronx. I'm also, my hometown. I'm also at a school downtown working in a program of young people whose lives have been touched by incarceration, specifically Rikers Island. So either they have been there or they have guardians or parents who have been there. And we're working through using arts, all the things that we know what arts does to liberate people's minds. And lately, I'm going through my own kind of transformation as I'm trying to work out this concept called the archaeology of the self, right? And so we know if you study education, you know, Foucault, that dude talked about the archaeology of knowledge. If you study philosophy and psychology, there is this understanding of self-knowledge and getting to know yourself, and it's also in mindfulness teaching. But I'm trying to bring it into education and work out this model. So to answer the question for me, and I do it in my own practice, fundamentally there has to be a critical love. And just not love like, oh, I love you, oh, I just love you. No. Love, and the love that Bell Hooks talks about, that if a child doesn't feel love through justice, then the child may never really understand love at all. The love that Martin Luther King talks about, right? Love that is not anemic, but love that is bound up in justice. People understanding when Bettina Love talks about co-conspirators, that you're putting something on the line for someone because you love their humanity. And so for me, the bottom line, and I tell my students in my class at TC, you're my student, automatically I love you. And since I have that love for you, I'm gonna talk to you about your racism. You're gonna talk about your racism. We're gonna talk about what you need to do, that self-excavation, that archaeology of the self, to find out where these issues live in you, to deal with it so that you can stop exacting harm. And for me, that is the non-negotiable. You have to love, in a very critical way, the children you are serving. And even if you are doing well or doing good, you have to do better.
Where are those libations? We need them, because Yoli is taking us there. So I think there are 3 non-negotiable principles, and I'm so glad that you talk about love, because that's certainly one of them for me. Love, justice, and joy. Remember earlier we talked about teachers doing things in 3s? I don't know why we do it, but we do. So those are my 3. Love, justice, and joy. And I'm also super inspired by my Shiro bell hooks, because we tend to think about love as mystical or magical or happenstance, and bell hook says, nah, bruh. That instead, love is the action you take to enhance or alter your own or someone else's well-being. Y'all got that? The action you take to enhance or alter your own or someone else's well-being. It is a process of humanization, right? And I think as an abolitionist myself, and as an abolitionist teacher, and someone who's always concerned about what that might look like in the classroom, moving beyond I love you, meaning I want to touch you, I want to pet you, or whatever, to really thinking about how you can step into your light as somebody who is doing something on the ground, all 10 toes on the ground, in order to make your life better and the lives of other folks better. I think that's sort of a shift in a different sort of direction. So to me, that is non-negotiable. If you're not talking about love, you're not really speaking my language. But I also think we need to be really forthright around a commitment to justice, right? And people, we can get confused around justice. So I like to keep it real focused, specifically when I'm in the classroom and I'm having conversations about what that can look like. And I think that justice in educational spaces means that classrooms are multiracial, they're multilingual, and they're grounded in the wisdom and experiences of the students. Those are the folks who are there to teach, who are there to guide the way that we move throughout the world and how we create curriculum to serve them, period. So if you ain't talking about justice, you ain't speaking my language. Also, if you are not coming to this work from a joyful space, there are lots of other things you could be doing. I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, and I got a bad case of wanderlust, which means that my babies could be any of y'all students. So if you don't come to the classroom from a space of joy, despite all of the work that is to be done, there is always basket weaving, right? Other things that don't require.
And Bell Hooks tells us that we have to find joy in the work.
And we have to find joy in the work. Mm-hmm. So for me, Marc, I feel like you moderating. Now I want to answer your questions. You're good
I just
at
learned
this.
so much from y'all. Honestly, I'm
it's
happy
a beautiful
to listen.
thing. So I would say that those 3 things are non-negotiables. I was just in a session with, what's the sister's name? Who led the leadership? April, is she here? Yeah. Sister had an hour-long discussion of the ways in which love, justice, and joy could be invoked in practice. And part of it is what I think your work, your scholarship, and your life experiences speak to. So perhaps we can jump into those. What might some racial literacy skills look like as a way to intervene in the school-to-prison pipeline? What does that mean?
Racial literacy just fundamentally means taking action when you see injustice and inequality. So just like you say you have a math skill, or you like to write. If you're not doing it, you're not practicing it, it's just laying dormant, right? So racial literacy fundamentally requires when you're in the teacher's lounge and people are talking about that child or talking about that community that actually you're there to serve. You have to be willing to know that you might lose some friends. You have to be willing to know that you might be looked at as, oh, there's that kind of teacher. And before you can move to racial literacy or culturally responsive education and all of these wonderful ways that the field is going, for me it has to be the archaeology of the self, because you have to do that deep digging so that when you do come to this idea of being an interrupter, right, that it is something that is a knee-jerk reaction. It is natural. You have considered all that you might lose. You have also considered all that you will gain and all that your students will gain. So for me, it looks like action. And the model that I'm working on with a doctoral student and friend, Angel Acosta, There are 6 components of racial literacy development. At the bottom, it's critical love. There has to be a critical humility. You must accept that you do not know everything, although you paid for your degree and you paid to be in the classroom. There has to be a critical reflection, constantly reflecting, what did I do right? What could I have done differently? There has to be a historical literacy, right? Khalil Muhammad, who used to run the Schomburg Center, is now a professor at Harvard. He talks about historical literacy. Ibram Kendi has given us a beautiful tour de force of a book and Stamped from the Beginning. You have to know the historical literacy of the US and how the enslavement project started. We're sitting in 400 years of inequality. 2019 marks 400 years from 1619 when the first captives came. But the history is not just about enslavement. It's also the history of the community that you're in. You have to know that local history so that you can bring that into the classroom. Finally, you have to be willing to interrupt. That's what racial literacy looks like. It's about being courageous and understanding the moral imperative of serving children who are not your own.
I'm thinking part of the reason that we ought to be concerned with what we ground our work in is, certainly so that we have clarity in terms of explaining what we do and why we do it. But also I think that what you are probably feeling right now after a day and a half of this wonderful event is a little bit of overwhelm, yeah? Right? Like, okay, the snaps are in the room. Okay, so feeling like there is so much work to be done, and there is so much to learn, and you need to learn it like yesterday. So trying to figure out what is non-negotiable, what is at your core, really does not only direct your clarity, but quite frankly, it helps to keep you sane. It helps to keep you moving in a specific direction. So I'm gonna ask you, Marc, about racial literacy, about hip-hop pedagogy in particular, because can't get enough of beats and rhymes, right? So we have to talk about that. But I just want to mention to you really quickly this idea of core. Any fitness people in the room? Any? Shout out. Anybody else? Shout out. Okay. Over here, any fitness? See, this is a whole other discussion. We need a... Y'all got to take care of yourselves, okay? We need some freedom fighters to have a lot of self-love going on. One of my favorite mentors told me that you can't do anything that you want to do as an educator if you can't explain it to yourself and to other people, specifically a 4th grader or somebody 9 or 10 years old. If you can't do that, then you really don't know what you're doing. So if you have a strong core as a fitness person, you know that you can do what you need to do. I'm a yogi, upside down, all that good stuff. But also, educationally, it's true. If you are not clear about what is at your center, then you really don't know what you're doing. So part of what we're doing is we're building a toolkit of folks who are doing anti-prison work, anti-school to prison pipeline work. We're trying to get clear about what is at our core. Can you explain to a 4th grader or a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old what it is that you do and why? What are those fundamental non-negotiable principles? And then how can we fold those into specific skill sets, action steps that we can build out that can continue on with us as we do what we do? So racial literacy, hip-hop pedagogy, culturally responsive or sustaining pedagogy, how are those things connected to this conversation? How do they help further our work, nudge us along, or maybe even say a bit about what those things are?
It's been so long. I did my field work for hip hop literacy in 2003. Jesus, I don't know where the time went, man. Wow. I ain't had no gray hair then.
You don't have gray hair now.
Shit. I know when to cut it now. So I think I'll say a little bit about that, and I'll talk a little bit about the work that I do now. For my initial field work was inside of a classroom in South Philadelphia. It's my first book, Beach Rhymes and Classroom Life. And there had been some important interventions around hip-hop-based education that were helpful. Ernest Morel, Jeff Duncan Andrade, we were building on the work of people like Carol Lee, of course, Gloria Ladson-Billings, the great Greg Demetriadis. And a lot of people hold Greg out for a second because he was doing something slightly different. People were asking, does this stuff work? What does it look like and does this stuff work? If I bring hip-hop text into a classroom, if I use vernacular literacies or vernacular text in the classroom, a signifying text, like their eyes are watching God, can students still learn these outcomes? Can students still raise their inferential reading scores? Can they still know the difference between tone and mood, as an example? And these were important questions. When I entered the field, though, as an anthropologist, I was asking different questions. I was less interested in the texts themselves, although I ultimately became interested in the text. But I was more interested in the classroom. I was more interested in the cultural practices of the classroom, the rituals of the classroom. I was wondering, who can you be in this classroom that you can't be in other kind of spaces? What kind of identity work is happening in this spaces? What kind of classroom field do we create within this context? And so what I found was that inside of classrooms where hip-hop texts were at the center, not so that you can learn Shakespeare later, not to say, oh, Biggie, you know, there's iambic pentameter in here just like there is in there. You know, it wasn't that. It was to understand the text on their own terms and for students to have a certain kind of engagement. What I found, of course, attendance was great, was better. All the measurable stuff was fine, was good. Measurable stuff matters. I'm not saying it doesn't. But I was more interested in the type of freedom, the type of what we call wounded healing that was able to happen in the classroom, the type of confessional space the classroom became, and also to think seriously about the type of labor that puts on a teacher. All these things were part of the conversation, but at the core, I was wondering, who can we be in classrooms that are designed differently? Who can we be in educational spaces that are imagined differently? Since then, I've done more classroom work, but less work in the classroom, and I've been more interested in out-of-school spaces. I've been more interested in what happens in a black bookstore. I spent 5 years doing field work in a black bookstore, in several black bookstores, doing kind of multi-sited ethnography across these spaces to figure out who could you be in these spaces, right? There was a question by Christopher Small, who's a musicologist, who said, why are these people listening to this music in this time at this place? Guthrie Ramsey built on it in his book, Race Music. And I was asking a very similar ethnographic question with regard to the books, right? When you're in this space having a kind of literacy event, who are you? Well, who can you be? Why this text? Why at this time? Why are we passing Ebony and Jet around in the beauty shop? Or Essence, probably. Why is this Bible study, why is Exodus so important to us right now? Why was closing Paul up so important to Howard Thurman? We know the answer is the slave part, but the question is, how do we engage with these texts? And so I was trying to raise my understanding of this so that we could reimagine education even outside the context of formal school, so we could figure out what people are doing. In the last 5 years, I've been doing field work in the Middle East, mostly in Jerusalem, mostly in East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem, thinking about how Afro-Palestinian children are engaging in certain types of literacy work and certain kinds of political work through the text. And so all these questions for me enrich my understanding of what's possible for black people and other vulnerable people when we decide what the texts are. When the goal of education isn't purely to do well on a Tojihi that's the standardized test in Jerusalem or in the West Bank, or a PSSA in Pennsylvania, or whatever or the Regents, or whatever the thing might be, but when freedom is at the end of that line. Mary O'Reilly wrote a book called The Peaceable Classroom many years ago, and she recalled how in her day, when she was studying with an Egyptian postmodern theorist, and they had these teach-ins against the Vietnam War, she was provoked by this question: how can we teach English in a way that will stop people from killing each other? And that question has always stuck with me. But as an abolitionist, the question is, how can we do school in ways that will stop us from caging each other? And so, as I think about the principles from my field work, the principles from my practice, the principles from the institutions I've tried to build in my own city, the question again is, how can I create educational environments? How can I do school, and I mean school big picture, really education. How can I do it in ways that will stop us from caging each other? How can I do work that will make us free? And I think, again, the principles of abolition come in. Part of why Hip Hop Lit works, or part of why black bookstores work, is because everybody's allowed in. I mean, we ain't got no rules. You can't be up in here fighting. You can't be up here. You know what I mean? I'm not saying there's no rules, but at the core, we're not making distinctions about who's a struggling reader and who's not. We're not making distinctions between who's engaged or who's at risk and who's not at risk. So these are the kind of conversations that I think we had that are more inclusive. When we see mistakes, we try to correct mistakes rather than cast people out. This is important in terms of the principle of abolition. Because part of what the logic of the prison does is it says that when people do harm, we get rid of them, we throw them away. It's part of a broader cancel culture, right? We canceling folk, we getting rid of folk. We calling people out instead of calling people in. There's a logic that says that when people do harm, we get rid of them. That's why we suspend kids for cutting school. I mean, it's the dumbest shit ever, right? You cut school for 3 days, your punishment, stay home for 3 days. Word? So how can we create spaces within our classroom where when conflict emerges, we can resolve it as a community, and at the moments where people do harm that does not allow them to be in the community at that moment, to the abolitionist question in your head, what do we do with the murderers and the rapists and the molesters? What do we do with them? We can't just give them work release. Understood. But we have to imagine possibilities of even when we have to put people out of a particular community at a moment, they are not out of the society and they are not out of the reach of care and correction. That changes how we do school as a practical matter. That makes school discipline look different. Yes. You see what I mean? Because I know I'm a little more abstract with this sometimes, but this is concrete. And then last, let me just say one more thing, because I know it's going to come back around. A lot of people will be like, yeah, but what about this, what about... I promise you, I do not have all the answers for abolition. You will, if you ask me enough, if you pepper me with enough questions, I will be stumped. And I will not have an answer for what to do with this particular thing at this moment. But the legitimacy of abolition does not hinge on me being able to imagine an answer to every problem. They asked Fidel a long time ago, where has socialism worked? And he said, well, I can't answer that entirely, but I can tell you where capitalism has failed us everywhere. What's happening right now isn't working. The prison isn't working. I know abolition works. And so, yeah, there are moments where I have a crisis of imagination because my entire world and universe has been built around the prison and the carceral state, to use your language, the Foucauldian approach in terms of the disciplining of my very body. I don't know. I have to decriminalize my imagination.
There are others who do, and there are others who are studying it. So, and even when we look to one person and say, oh, well, look, there's a hole in that research. No, we tend to do that to find an escape door. Right. There are people who are studying it and living it in addition to what Marc is doing, in addition to what Crystal is doing. That's why I'm saying it has to be within. You have to be willing to find the answers. Yeah. You have to be willing. Yeah. And say you don't know. My favorite refrain. I don't know.
I want to ask one more question, and then I want to invite you all in, yeah? The theme of our time together is, I want to join the Love Fest. Oh, my God. Jeez. The theme of our time together is schooling for freedom. So we riffed on that a bit in the earlier panel and had, I think, a good discussion around engagement and taking seriously what it might mean to engage young people as a foundation for schooling for freedom, really moving away from or developing a greater imagination for what it would take to think about education and schooling in ways that really matter to young people. But let's take that further. What would schooling for freedom require of us, enable for us? What might that look like? Hang on to that for a moment.
I'm thinking about Toni Morrison and, of course, James Baldwin, but specifically Toni Morrison when she talks about language. And if you've not heard or listened to her Nobel laureate speech, it's 33 minutes of ear candy. It's incredible. I think we have to liberate ourselves from the deficit language that we have. But before we can liberate ourselves from the deficit language, we have to liberate ourselves from the deficit thinking that we have about children. When we talk about freedom in a classroom, we're doing this project in it's in Yonkers, I'm gonna say it, I'm gonna name it. And the students that I'm working with, I'm doing work around racial literacy, culturally relevant education, and they are observing classrooms. And the language of one particular teacher is so oppressive that literally you can see the children like stop in their tracks. No, that doesn't work. No, that's incorrect. No, what's the matter? You didn't study? I mean, the language in which we engage with our children in classrooms shuts them down. And yet, we are prisoners of our own way of thinking, and that's the stuff that comes out of our mouths. Also, what's in your heart. If your heart is dark, the work is going to be dark, right? If the way that you think is in a dark, deficit way, what you say will be dark and deficit. So I think the first point of liberation is to liberate ourselves from the deficit language and the deficit thinking of the children that we serve. And what we say to children in classrooms, that shapes the type of culture, to talk about culture as a fluid concept, that shapes the type of culture that's happening in classrooms. And then children will then become freer to say things, to make mistakes. But we think we have to be perfect, and we've got to do self-work, y'all. It has to be the self-work. That's the only thing I can say. And this is where I am right now. I'm trying to do my own self-work. If we're not willing to do the self-work, what we think and what we say will not shift.
Real. One of my favorite academic books, or research-based books, is called Bad Boys. Y'all know this book? By Ann Ferguson. So related to this notion of freeing ourselves by focusing on our language and really moving away from deficit-based thinking and ways of being and trying to approach more asset-based ways of doing stuff. But I'm just tell you real quickly, there's a focus on black boys and the over-disciplining of black boys in elementary schools. And one thing that Ann Ferguson discovered when she was doing her field work was that black boys as young as 9 and 10 years old were described in their presence as bad, as unsalvageable, as bound for jail. So when we're thinking about being folks who are not redeemable, right, when we're thinking about what it might mean to speak dark, to think dark, to speak dark, and then the impact that has on young people, I need us to see specific examples. When we're talking about moving away from deficit ways of talking, we are saying, y'all talk about bad kids all the time. Somebody does, right? What might it mean to rethink that? That's something real specific that we could be doing to school toward freedom, right? Because the way we think about folks shapes the way that we talk about folks, and the way that we talk about folks shapes the ways that we interact with them, and the ways in which we think about and shape our policy making, develop our processes and our practices in order to manage and interact with those folks, for sure.
You are brilliant. Thank you.
So are you, my love.
Thank you. That's exactly, I was trying to say that, y'all.
Thinking a lot of stuff, but I'll be brief because I want to hear. I know we want to hear from folk. I'm wearing this T-shirt. Second chances, good love, healthy choices, second chances.
Sounds like my love life. You have to have humor in this, y'all. I'm telling you.
Yeah, I understand.
Do this work, you have to know how to laugh. Yes. That's part of self-care.
Time to be third chances, fourth chances.
15.
Right. So I was reading, I read a lot, and there's a wonderful book, Heavy. Really one of the best memoirs I think I've read ever, to be sure, but certainly one of the best ones I've read. And there's been a lot of great memoirs in the last few years. Darnell Moore wrote a wonderful one. I mean, I could go on about just all the memoirs. I mean, Charlene Carruthers wrote a great book. Anyway, we can go on. But Heavy is a beautiful book, and if you don't read any other memoir this year, read Heavy. But our author, Lamont, has written in other things. One of the things he talks about is this idea of unreasonable love. He said, I want to be loved by an unreasonable love. You know, I mean, that's a whole other thing. That explodes. I mean, everything we believe up here is unreasonable. You know, the idea of a world without prisons is unreasonable. The evidence is against it, right? The evidence was against the abolition of slavery. The evidence was against it. We had an unreasonable love and an unreasonable and abiding faith that the impossible was possible, and so we continue to do it. And so I always appeal to CUESEF for a certain kind of sobering, but also a certain kind of inspiration. And he talks about this idea of good love, healthy choices, second chances. And when I think about a model for how I want to move forward through school, I think in some or any part of my life, honestly, for me, it's as much an affirmation as it is an end goal. And it is to say good love, healthy choices, and second chances can guide us. For me, good love is not just about the romantic or the erotic, although those things are necessary too. But it's about self-love. It's about love of community. It's about loving the image and the body that's in our mirror. It's about understanding and loving vulnerable people. It's about understanding the fundamental humanity of everybody. And so when we enter classrooms, good love for me means believing that all children are worth investing in, that children's cultures are worth appealing to, that children's points of view and positionality in the world and identities are all worth engaging, taking seriously, and investing in. And with regard to school discipline, it means that I believe, again, that you come in as more than an at-risk youth. In fact, I don't want to use that language to think about you, that I begin to destroy the scripts I have in my mind of who and what you are, so that when Ann Ferguson writes about those bad boys, and I think at the beginning of that book, they're saying these kids are going to be in prison. This is going to be an inmate. I mean, that's like the opening language of the text. We have to find a way to get that stuff out, because that doesn't just shape our personal politics. Because that's kind of what happens in the world. We always act like racism and sexism are these personal things that we can keep at arm's length. He's harmless. He's racist, but he's harmless. What does he do? Oh, he's a mortgage broker. Shit. So, what Russell Skipper talks about this idea of disciplinary moments, and this idea, so much of what happens with school discipline isn't about a kid punching somebody in the face, or somebody bringing a gun to school, or smoking crack in the back of the classroom, things that we probably as a community could agree do a certain kind of disruption to our classroom. A lot of times it's the teacher having to make a subjective interpretation of students' behavior. I have to decide if you're aggressive. I have to decide if you're disruptive. As significant for them, say, you have to decide if you're one of those loud black girls in a way that's negative, right? As opposed to those aggressive, engaged white boys. Right? So I have to make determinations about your behavior and then decide what to do with it. Right. The spirit of good love says that I believe, I begin from a premise that you're a good person. I believe from the premise that you're worth investing in. I begin from the premise that you belong in this classroom, so that I'm not looking for every excuse to get rid of you. Healthy choices is a structural issue for me as much as anything else. Everybody deserves access to good love, but everybody deserves access to healthy choices. What does our built environment look like? What does the school lunchroom look like? What food options do we have? Look at the work of Moms Rising in terms of what's in our cafeterias. What kind of curriculum do we have? Can I see myself in it? Because if every time I open the text, I see someone who does not look like me, or I believe that queer folk are invisible, or trans folk have never existed, or black folk are only relevant in February, you know what I mean? If there are very narrow ways to understand myself, if I think that no one has ever shaped history from a wheelchair, if this becomes my understanding, then the curriculum itself is an unhealthy choice. Because you're asking me, and you're right, it's not even a choice at that level, right? Because I either do school or get kicked or get pushed out of school. Neither of which are healthy choices. So for me, we have to create environments so young people can make healthy choices, not giving them access to the things that we know make them less likely to commit suicide, less likely to drop out, less likely to get arrested, less likely. I mean, we understand what works. So if we don't give people access to those choices, then they can't make healthy choices. And then we judge them for making unhealthy choices. And then finally, second chances. Everybody deserves a second chance. But structurally, we have no safety net. The opioid addiction is something we need to fix. My children are addicted now. We need care. We need rehab. We needed that in 1985. But the problem is, we create a world, and this is the last thing I'll say, I promise, where we construct people in such a way that they're not only making an unhealthy choice or a bad choice, they're actually bad people. And so so because they're bad people rather than people who made a bad choice, we don't think they need second chances. I'll give you one quick example. The crack powder cocaine differential. Crack is a bad thing. And you say somebody's a crackhead, that's not just an unhealthy choice. If I say he's a cokehead, you might imagine you might think your lawyer, your accountant. You might still choose the attorney if I told you he was a cokehead, as long as he go to work every day. But if I told you your attorney was a crackhead, you would not hire him. You know what I'm saying? Like Bernie Sanders went around the country with somebody named Killer Mike as his surrogate. He would not go around the country with somebody named Crackhead Mike, right? So we make these extraordinary moral judgments about people on crack, not coincidentally vulnerable, poor, black and brown folk. So cokeheads make bad choices. Crackheads are bad people. Where do bad people belong? Prison. So if we imagine these kids as bad people, it's much easier to get rid of them, to expel them, to suspend them, to not worry about them, to have Joe Clark kick out half the school and lean on me, and the audience cheers because we think they don't belong there anyway. This becomes, I know I dated myself, this becomes part of the narrative. So for me, as we do school, we have to do it in a way that believes that everybody deserves good love, everybody deserves healthy choices, and everybody deserves second chances.
These two. All right, it's getting hot in here. We're good and warm. But we're just getting started. So let's find the folks in the room who want to contribute to the convo. Bring your spirit up to the stage. I see a bunch of hands. Oh, fabulous. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marcy. I'm a high school student here in Pittsburgh. So I know that there is a lot of teachers and administrators here today, and I want to thank you for that because you are making that change for us and for my younger siblings. But as students in high school, what can we do when we see these policies and programs in our communities, in our own schools, and in our sibling schools? How can we make that change to end the school-to-prison pipeline? Thank you.
I think any of us can talk about that. Rise up, rise up. You have, I don't think this is on, but you have the beauty of, this is when we talk about historical literacy. It's the young people in this world who have really shifted movements. I can think about SNCC. I think about those children, specifically the civil rights, because I tend to live in that era, who knew school was important, but they also knew to give their bodies up to be incarcerated for the cause. There's this thing in research called YPAR, Youth Participatory Action Research. Marc has done so much work in that field. You have wonderful, beautiful examples. The thing is, when you come together, stay in solidarity, figure out what your focus is, be strategic, find your co-conspirators, which may be other young people or maybe adults, and be very focused and rise up, because that's the only way that we have ever made any change. And you see that globally. There is a place for protest.
Greetings to the panel. Thanks for all that you've shared thus far. My name is Medina Jackson of the PRIDE program, which stands for Positive Racial Identity Development in Early Education.
Wait, say that again, sis.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Positive Racial Identity Development in Early Education, PRIDE. Yep. So, snaps for that. And I really appreciate the point that you brought up around doing that self-work. Self-reflection, I'm a big advocate of that. So can you talk about the ways that you engage in self-reflection, self-analysis, that uprooting, that healing work from the trauma that racism instills in all of us? And can you also talk about what you say or what you do to kind of challenge this idea that that kind of work is not important, that it's soft work, and that it's not foundational to how we show up in the world and how we show up with the children that we work with?
Beautiful, beautiful questions. I'll give you one example. Last year, I went into noble silence for 10 days. And so there was no phone, no books, no writing, nothing, no eye contact. And I went in purposely. I waited 7 years to do this. And I went in purposely to do a lot of work around issues in my family, with my father, with my daughter, and with this work that I do. And so prayer and meditation have been central for me in doing this work. The work itself has been a bit of a meditation and prayer, because without doing this work, I think I would be extremely angry. I would pop off all the time. That's kind of part of who I am too. And I work judiciously to move forward in love. And that is only through the power for me of prayer and meditation and practicing what I preach, right? For those who say that this is soft work and, right, that's the problem right there. That's why we're in the situation that we're in, because we're not doing the self-work. We're busy looking at numbers and data and doing what we've been doing since I always go back to the point of integration, and the masses aren't doing well. I'm not talking about the few hundred children that get selected to go to elite schools, and those programs are great, ABC, Oliver program, all of that. Until the masses are having equity and equal opportunity, then we have to know that the system is not working, and therefore there's room for improvement, and let's do something that we haven't tried. But here's the beautiful thing. We are starting to do that, because schools are now not just through restorative justice done right, not like restorative justice and you're using the same language about children, right? But yoga in schools, mindfulness in schools. The last thing I'll say is I work with the New York City Department of Education, New York City Men Teach. This year, for our professional development, yes, we talked about race, racism, homophobia, all of those things that are poison and spirit murdering for children and teachers, and we ended by meditating. This year, we're introducing yoga. And so you got to change the system. The system's not going to change on its own. Does that make sense? Yeah. You might as well keep it, baby. It's for you.
So my name's Khalil. I'm the CEO and co-founder of an organization, Young Black Motivated Kings and Queens. And I'm also the youth activism coordinator for an organization called One Hood Media. And so a lot of the work I do is youth-led and is youth-involved. And the question I had was, oftentimes we talk about freedom within the schools that we go to, but I think a lot of youth carry and aren't free from the issues within their community that they're facing. And so how do we fix that and educate the staff that's within those schools on how to deal with the issues that are happening? Because I think a lot of times we hire staff that aren't engaged within the communities that they're working in.
You said the staff inside the school isn't necessarily understanding what's happening in the community in terms of the lives of the kids, right? I mean, I hate that you even have to, I hate that you feel responsible for making that happen. That's the first problem, right? I think we as educators and those who educate educators have to be more mindful of the entire environment that young people engage. I remember teaching at a school in South Philadelphia that was, let's just say it was on 3rd and A Street. And the kid lived on 21st and A Street. And it wasn't a long walk when you're 14, 15. I wouldn't do it, but it was it's probably about a 20-minute walk to school. Wasn't a big deal. But he wouldn't come to school twice a week. And he seemed engaged to me. He was a smart kid, and I always wondered why he would miss 2 days a week. I'm like, yo, you really messed up your grades? Because he would show up on he would be absent on test day and show up the day before and do really good on the reviews. And I was like, yo, why you ain't come to school? And he was like, well, Raheem ain't come to school. And so-and-so ain't come to school. And I was like, I gave him this whole long dramatic speech about, they jump, you get older, they jump off a bridge, you gonna jump off a bridge, all the stuff your grandfather did. And then later I realized, not from him, but from someone else, that in South Philly doesn't have gangs per se anymore, but what they do have is blocks battle each other. 5th Street battles 12th Street, and so forth and so on. And so he had to walk through 3 or 4 different hoods, essentially, certainly 3 or 4 different blocks to get to school. And he was like, I'm not walking to 5th Street by myself. I need 3 other people, not because I care about what's going on in school, but because, what's not going on, but because I'm not getting jumped every day going to school, which made a lot of sense to me. And we could make provisions for that once we understood that. We didn't understand that. And he didn't necessarily want to tell me that for a whole bunch of reasons. One, he didn't want to snitch. Two, I'm sure by 9th or 10th grade, he didn't think that school had given him no indication that they cared about that. So that's just an example to talk about the way that our disconnect from school. And I would have told you I knew everything about this kid. I knew his mom, I knew his dad, I was in communication with him, I thought I did the right things, but there's this other kind of structural stuff and this other neighborhood stuff that I just hadn't thought about. Part of what we need is teacher education that reminds educators and encourages educators and equips educators in such a way that they think beyond what happens in the walls of their classroom, that we think about what's happening at home, that we have relationships with parents, that we don't just call the house when something bad happens. Because most parents, when they see school district of Philadelphia back in the day on the caller ID, they wasn't answering that because they don't want to hear that shit. Ain't no good news coming. Unless it's a snow day. And it wasn't snowing, so they was like, ain't no good news coming from this. So we have to create a different dynamic and a different relationship. Another thing we have to do is we have to physically be there for so many parents, man. Coming back to the school building is like returning to the scene of a crime. You know, like school is where you learn you were a problem. School is where they said you were a bad kid. School is where you learn all these things. And they don't want to come back to that. They don't want to come back to this unhealthy relationship to this particular institution. So we have to also find new ways to engage the community. So I'm not avoiding your question, which is what can you do, but I almost don't want you to feel like you need to be. I want to begin from the premise that you don't need to be doing this work. However, we are where we are. I think youth organizing is key. I think, in Philadelphia, we have this Philadelphia Student Union. And the Philadelphia Student Union has done an amazing job. I used to be on the board of it, and I can't take much credit for what they did. We kind of stood back and watched and advised when necessary. But it was really about them leveraging their power to make demands of institutions. And sometimes the institutional demands are things like clean drinking water at Overbrook High School. They didn't have water fountains there for almost, I think it was 15 years. They hadn't water fountains. So sometimes it's big scale stuff like when the governor at the time was dumping money into prisons and not into schools. But it's also about demanding things in the community that can concretely change the relationship between teachers and the students and teachers and the communities they serve. So maybe parent-teacher night isn't 5 o'clock on Wednesday when most people are still at work or they're juggling multiple things. And maybe parent-teacher night ain't at the school since we understand that relationship. Maybe it's in the community center. Maybe it's at the church. Maybe it could be somewhere else. Maybe it could be online. What are the ways that we can change that dynamic so that we can partner with parents to understand what's going on in the lives of young people? And how can we empower young people to lead and to voice themselves in such a way that we hear you when you say, I'm not walking through 16 blocks, and we don't just give you 50-year-old lectures about being an individual. So these are just some things I think we can do.
Good afternoon.
Where are you, sis?
Right here.
Thank you.
So my question is for everybody. What would be the purpose of education universally? I heard these beautiful words of making you whole, love, joy, justice, but universally to the point that even the parents are still getting educated. And if you think about what kind of education did the people have that built the pyramids that are still standing today? And that with pride that people built those pyramids. So I have an idea, but I'd like to know what you think is the purpose of education that would be universal.
You might have the right answer. Why don't you tell us what you think?
What do I think? Well, it's to make the world better. You know what I mean? And if everybody came with that purpose and you ask students, what's up with your community? What's going on? How can you improve it? That's what Booker T. Washington did, So they saw that the people needed wheels, so they made wheels. Anyway, that's a conversation.
I think that's right. I think there's a universal. I think there's a way we can understand education in the universal sense of making the world better, or justice, love, healing, wholeness, all that stuff. I think that's all part of making the world better. But I also think it's important to attend to the local. So there's a universal principle of making the world better, but what that means for me might be different than what that means for you, what that might mean for Pittsburgh, what that might mean. I remember driving, and by the way, I'm doing tonight, we got an event, me and Mumia Abu Jamal are doing an event tonight at 7. Where is it at? Lawrenceville? Lawrenceville. And I remember when Mumia and I were writing this book, Homewood, I'm sorry, I don't hear, oh, that makes more sense. Yeah, I have all y'all in Lawrenceville, New Jersey instead of Homewood, which is a lot closer. But I remember driving to, when Mumia and I were writing our first book together 8 years ago, I would fly to Pittsburgh and then drive to SCI Green. And so I would fly, and then I drive however long it takes. I'd go get a car and then drive. And as I would drive through, I looked at this. I was very interested in this town, and how indebted this town was to the prison, and what the guard shifts looked like. How many people were cafeteria or electrician or otherwise connected to the prison through some kind of consultant or service-oriented job, in addition to the people who were actual correctional officers. And when I was like, as you all know, I mean, a lot of towns are like this. The town could not exist without the prison. So what education is a universal, if we understand education as universal good, in a town like that, what does political education look like? What is education to create jobs that don't rely on the prison? You get what I mean? It's a very specific thing. You know, when I think about what people would need who are incarcerated, what kind of education do they need to be able to imagine new possibilities? It might be different. To the black girl that's told that she has the wrong hips and lips and nose and skin color and body size, what kind of education is needed? How do I get white people to unlearn white supremacy, including white liberals, especially white liberals sometimes? Y'all can be the most dangerous. How can we understand that? And what kind of education do you need? How can I help people unlearn anti-Semitism? What kind of world do I need in Paris or Germany or the United States to teach people to destroy these ugly, vicious narratives of anti-Semitism? How do I do that, right? I'm okay with the universal good, but I think too often, if we take the idea of a universal good, too often universal goods have not done well for black folk, because the norm is never us. The template is never us. So universal often means white and male and heterosexual and cisgendered and Christian and middle class. And so we end up trying to contort ourselves to fit this universal good. That's how we end up with success for all. That's how we end up with standardized testing. That's how we end up with accountability measures that don't really hold us accountable for a whole lot. So I want to mix those two. I want to have a universal value, but a local practice and reckoning with that value.
Okay, hi. I'm Sylvia Wilson from Pittsburgh. And some of the things you talked about with teachers and making that first phone call, that's something that good teachers have done all the time, and not make that first contact to be a negative one. But I'm really looking at some of the other comments you made about the system, change the system, change the system. As an educator, I've always kind of fought against standardized testing, but that's what we have to do. I would rather have assessments that show what children really learn so that they can apply what they learn, and I know what they really have. That's what we would want. That's what most educators want. However, the bigger system is those who provide us with the money through the government. It's hard to break that system down because you have to, they want us to be accountable, and their only ways of accountability are through those kinds of systems. Now I'm a school board member, and it would be great as a school board member to say we're going to do away with it. But again, I'm being realistic. I know that we can't just cancel them out because we depend on the funds that are coming in so that we can educate our children. So it's a wonderful thing to think about changing that system, but it is such a huge and large task to do. That would be the right thing to do, but then how would those who give that money, allow us to continue to get the funding that we need to educate our children? Oops, you're tripping me, you're tripping me.
For that, and that is, the problem that we live with, but this is where we come in and we talk about like radical imagination, right? There are places, and I'm talking about New York, and I imagine that there are other states and cities as well where standardized tests are being abolished, right? It happens to be in some of the more wealthier neighborhoods, right? Because they have the capital, right, and the influence to make it happen. Also in our higher education, there's some of these so-called elite colleges that are no longer accepting the need for the SAT. So someone somewhere had to do this kind of reimagining and then put action to it to make it happen. So it is a slow move, but it's happening. And so what can we learn from those communities that have been able to say, no, my children will not go by these standardized test measures? Or what was the thinking of the higher education officials that said, yes, we're going to join and not take the ACT, the SAT, and to really study what they do and figure out how that could be part of the strategy if that's what you're trying to implement. And this is what Marc is talking about, of really focusing on the global, right? There's the universal, let's abolish all tests, but how does it play out in the local context? And what can we learn from folks that have done it and bring it into our context? And never stop dreaming. I mean, I think about my ancestors. If they had ever stopped dreaming, if Harriet had never dreamed, I don't even know if I would be here. And so that's where that radical imagination, that's where, for those of you who are readers and you need inspiration, magical realism, Afrofuturism, pick up some Octavia Butler and be inspired, and think about a world that does not yet exist, a world that none of us in this room may not see, but we can at least try to plant the seeds for it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have time for maybe 2 more wonderings, worries, or questions.
Right. Thank you. I'll be one of those. I'd like to thank you for being here on the panel and sharing your wisdom and knowledge. One is an observation. The second part is a question. I'm president and founder of a group called the Center for Family Excellence, where Dr. Jerome Taylor is the president. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the success that we've had working in male mentoring. We put together a group of men that were in social service called the Male Coalition. We've been in existence for over 20 years. It's a group of prison guards, lawyers, doctors, men in recovery. We've been able to get into many of the schools. The dilemma that we find is in some of the schools, such as Pittsburgh Public Schools, you have major hoops that you have to jump through to bring grassroots folks into the program. So we started out in charter schools like Manchester Academic Charter School. We have Capiola. We have a new program that we found called Hands Up, Guns Down. This is a group of professional boxers who have come in, non-contact, mid and glove work with girls and guys. And what we're finding is that those students are dying to get to the class, and it's increasing. We're working also closing the racial achievement gap and combining those two programs together. But the dilemma that we have is public schools have a very strict criteria for grassroots programs to come in and provide these kind of services. We have reputational, decisional, organizational leaders who are in our community who don't have criminal records, 33, 34 clearances are fine, but they can't come in and spend time with their own children from their own community. So I'd like to find out if you have any feedback on policies and best practices that can change in order that we can take care of our own and our own community.
We're up here talking because we don't know that we know the answer to that, and we're just trying to figure out where in our experiences or knowledge that we can at least be respectful and honor your question.
Yeah, and if there are people in the room who have a good answer to that or who've had experience doing that, you know, I know with Hip Hop Lit, I mean, one of the challenges was similar, you know, getting into the school, being, because so much of it at the time was test-centered, that if the intervention didn't help people do better on the standardized test, they just weren't particularly interested. And honestly, the only way that they let us in was because we went to the night school program, and they felt like we were pulling the kids away. And I got you. We felt like we were pulling the kids who they thought weren't going to do well on the test out of traditional school. So in essence, they let us in because they thought we were taking the bad kids out and raising the school's test scores. So I guess I say that to say, and I don't know if this is helpful or not, if there's a way to frame your intervention, to frame the work you're doing in the language that they like, even if it's not legitimate. We just try and get in. We done a whole lot worse, right? Black folk was, you know, I mean, we done a whole lot, right? We snuck, what was it, David Walker's Appeal Behind the Bible on Sundays? I mean, sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. If there's a way to frame this as an intervention that'll help them do better on the standardized test, if there's a way to say it as this raises attendance, or whatever the measures are of success for them that get them their money, I guarantee you that will get you into the school. That I know for sure. What those measures are, what those buttons are, I don't know. But I know that in my experience, the way that I've gotten into schools is by framing my work in ways that make them happy around money and usually around test scores, so if that's helpful.
Working within institutions in spite of them.
I thought that sister had her hand up.
You had a comment on this? Yeah.
So I had two comments. One, if you position yourself to go in at lunchtime or recess, I've done this for like 30 years. You go in that lunchtime or recess, that's the most unmanageable time that you can select pods of students to develop a curriculum that's fun, that you're out playing if they're younger kids in the park or in their recess quarters, and then develop a fun curriculum that addresses whatever it is that you're addressing. They'll give you kids for that because there's only a couple adults that are usually out managing the yard or the recess area or the cafeteria, so you will have a select group, or you can identify a select group that gravitates towards you. So that is one of the tangibles that you can use. I'm sure that, you know, not too many people turn away help in the cafeteria and in recess, as long as you meet the requirements as far as your clearances, so that's definitely key. Second thing, since I have the mic, in doing this work, I thought of two things that teachers can take away from it. I'm not a teacher by choice, but I do instruct. I work with students that have been shot at or that are shooters, so you would technically say they were gang members. But if I come into a position and have the same mission that I had 10 years ago without modification, then I am not addressing the current student, because that 10-year-old classroom is not the same student. It's a whole nother generation of students. So I have to constantly start to reevaluate and reimagine me as who I can be for this next situation, and make this impossible situation in my mind, because I'm so tired and maybe distraught about my position and not being able to be as effective as I thought I would be as an instructor and a teacher, but make that impossibility the I am, so that teachers can see kids as I am possible and not impossible. When we come from that standpoint of impossibility, we don't see the goal. The goal now becomes a barrier, and it's not something we're moving towards, but it's something that stops us. So I'm encouraging you teachers to just continue to reimagine who you are and bring something that motivates you so you can be a motivation, and then just start to create and recreate your mission statement. So every day when you're getting up, that's who you become. And that's what you're striving for, that the block doesn't stop you, but the goal drives you through the block, and it's not a hindrance. It's a hard thing to do, I know, because I go in schools and I get to leave, but you have to stay. I get to go in and say, hey, you haven't been to school this many, or you're not doing this, or stop disrespecting your teacher, or stop, you can't live at this person's house anymore, you gotta really go home, those type of things. I can do that and then come home or go to another school, but when you're in the same classroom all day and you're relentlessly trying to get someone to learn something, you're like, they'll never learn it. Create something in yourself that makes you motivated, and that's something that we don't have the formula for that. That's an encouragement that you have to give to each other when you get into the building, and for yourself when you wake up and your feet touch the floor. What is driving you? And if there's nothing driving you, then you might have to take a break, and it's okay to take a break from some things, because teaching is This is a hard thing to do when you have to do it every day and your heart is getting broken. I buried more kids than you teach in a day, probably than you teach in a week. So I understand that sometimes you get stuck. I'm encouraging you to be unstuck for those who make it through, and that you're the one person that helped them make it through, help them not jump off that bridge, or help them not go and assault someone out of their frustration. So keep motivated, stay encouraged, stay new, stay in front of your goals so that you're pulling it, and keep your goals in front of you so it's pulling you.
Thank you.
Thank you for what you do, and we encourage you to keep doing that.
You've been standing for a long time, so how about you take us out?
Oh, okay.
No
Well,
pressure.
No pressure. My name is Joellen Character Rudolph, and I'm from a neighboring county, Beaver County, that a lot of people do not come from Beaver County to Allegheny County or vice versa. I think I'm one of the few. But what I want to thank you for especially, and I'm sorry I don't know your name, but okay, Sister Yolanda, is that I've been in education since the early 70s, and now embarking on a doctoral degree later in life here, and my research centers around what I'm reading about right now. Thank you for the encouragement about self-care, because some of what I'm reading is so heavy that you don't want to care for yourself. You just want to lay down and watch the 5th episode of Family Feud. But I know that some people say that's self-care, but that's like dangerous self-care in my position, because I need to get this work done. Okay. I am investigating racial discrimination in early childhood settings. And because I believe that you can't teach what you don't have, that was evident in some of what you all have expressed. You can't, our Christian or biblical precepts are that, love thy neighbor as thyself. What if you don't love thyself? And if you don't love thyself, then how are you going to love that neighbor, regardless of what the neighbor looks like, speaks like, dresses like, whatever. I'm talking about. So that internal work is what I would like to do with teachers now that I have been around teachers. I have substitute taught everywhere, trying to just see if it's different anywhere else. But it's all the same. It's all the same. I don't care what neighborhood, what school district, whether you consider yourself the upper crust or lower or whatever. It's all, we have the same woes. So my question is that it's so hard to sift out empirical data around this type of work. So I would like to request either a reading list, you threw out a bunch of books, or things that you would suggest that would be just must-read information for those of us that are doing this work, and who would, so that we can solidify our efforts. I think that we're stronger together, and if we could solidify. So I'm wondering if you would be willing to do that.
They happen to be colleagues, former colleagues of Marc, and friends of, I think, all of us. We at least know, I think the three of us at least know one of the people I'm about to mention, but specifically in early childhood classrooms, you'll want to look at the work of Deetra Price Dennis. She's at Teachers College. Deetra Price Dennis. You want to look at the work of Haney Yoon. Haney Yoon. Y-O-O-N is the last name. And you'll want to look at the work of Mariana Soto Manning. So these are three, happen to all be at Teachers College, But I think looking at their work, and they specifically look at racial discrimination, Detra is doing more work with racial literacy in early childhood classrooms and elementary classrooms. So those are the three I offer, and I think that'll open the door to many others.
Yeah, one other book. It's not focused on early childhood, but I think it'll give you some framing, which again will take you down that rabbit hole of everything else you're going to end up reading. I like the work of Micah Pollock. Micah Pollock, Pollock, first name Mica. And her book, Color Mute, I think is helpful for helping us think about the way that schools often don't, the failure to talk about race and name race and mention race is part of a broader kind of issue, which I think plays into the discrimination question. And I guess, by that logic, I guess, have you read much in critical race theory? Oh, good, okay. Yes, it's okay. That's a weird. You gonna get you as a John the Baptist. You gonna get you somebody that's gonna get you out of there. Hopefully your advisor.
Right.
But if not, we'll do it together. But getting into that stuff, and specifically the CRT work in education. You can look at the Gloria Ladson-Billings, the William Tate, Adrienne Dixon, Kamika Royal. There's a bunch of interesting stuff that I think again will help you frame it. I mean, sometimes when there's nothing as a graduate student, sometimes, and this may be helpful for all of you all, sometimes you'll be a graduate student, you say, I want to study this, I want to study this, I want to study this, then you're like, I can't find nothing on it, I'm going to study something else. Because it's easier to find something else than it is to, nobody wants to be, the pioneer on this stuff. But I think sometimes with the proper guidance, a lot of times the stuff is there. You have to be creative in terms of how you piece things together. Yeah. Yeah. Got you. And that's what I'm saying. That literature may help you, and you may need to delve into the literature and organizational leadership or organizational theories around workplace discrimination. You may need to go into legal theory and begin. I know it sounds daunting, but a lot of times the thing that seems the most difficult to do is much better than trying to do the easy thing and spending 3 years spinning your wheels and have that person keep sending you your document back like it's not enough, it's not grounded enough, you're not doing enough literature, it's not. Sometimes it's easier to just, sometimes like you try and carry 17 bags from the supermarket, you're like, I'm not making 2 trips back. And so you turn into like a world-class bodybuilder trying to struggle with those 17. And you actually could have just went back and got the other, 4 at a time and been done twice as fast.
Or you could have used a shopping cart.
How about that? Right. Exactly. So sometimes, so I'm saying the creativity I'm talking about and piecing together different literatures may sound daunting, but one, you'll actually know the work. And remember, the point of this dissertation is to become an expert and to know more than anybody about this subject. But beyond that, it may actually in the long term serve you better. And I don't know what you plan to do after you get your doctorate, but if you plan to do research and teaching, piecing together a bad dissertation just means your trip in the tenure line is going to be that much harder. Because now you got a dissertation that you passed, but you got work you can't publish. Because those blind reviewers ain't going to be friendly to you. Uh-oh. So it's just something to think about.
Yoli, Marc, can you hang around for a little bit for the folks who want to keep the conversation going? Excellent. Let's give these people some love.
She needs some love for moderating a wonderful panel. Brilliant.
Thank you all. I want to make certain that we are remain on task and get to our 145 locations, take a break, encourage each other on the way, give somebody a nice, strong hug and say, let's hang in there together and keep doing this work. So we'll see you in the next sessions at 145. If our panelists could just stay here for a moment for some photos.